Hey everyone, welcome to my first video blog of 2021. Now last week I posted a blog talking about mobility, spine mobility, and in particular the sorts of movements that we start to lose as we get older through lack of use. And that blog was received pretty well. So what I thought I'd do over the next few weeks is to do a series of practical videos to show you the actual exercises and the kind of movement patterns that you should be making sure that you can maintain as you get into your 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond. Now, as a bit of a refresher or a recap from last week's article, our spine should be able to do kind of four main things. So it should be able to flex, and so you should be able to flex like this. It should be able to extend. You should be able to extend like this. You should be able to laterally flex, so I should be able to bend to one side and then bend to the other side. And then I should be able to rotate around one way and then rotate around the other. Now, what you will see is that one or more of these movements will be compromised as we get older. And typically the ones that we see that people lose the quickest is in particular spinal extension. And it's largely because in our everyday life we spend a lot of time in this position. We often hunch a little bit. When we sit down we hunch. When we sit in our car, in our seats, or on the couch, we're in this position like this. And so we often then that becomes our standard posture. And so our ability to then be able to get into an extended position becomes quite compromised. In particular, apart from the lumbar spine being compromised, the whole thoracic spine starts going in the opposite direction. So we start getting a bit of a hump, and that becomes hugely problematic when you get into your 60s and beyond. So what we really want to do is we want to ensure that all of those movements take place through our own muscular use. And by that I mean what you don't want to do is you don't want to be taking yourself through ranges of motion by using your arms and grabbing and pulling yourself and rotating yourself around, because your muscular system hasn't been able to do that. And by twisting yourself and bending yourself in excessive movements, there is a chance that you can actually do some damage through your spine and the ligaments that support your spine. So what we want to do is we want to have exercises whereby our muscular system brings our body into these different movement patterns that we need. And if we do that, then we end up developing a pretty functional spine and core, which makes all of our sort of everyday activities better and easier to do. So let's run through some of these exercises. All right, so the first movement that we want to take our torso through is that of trunk flexion. So what's really an easy way of doing that is you can just do any sort of form of crunch. So there's lots of variations of crunch, and I've talked about many before, but basically just the process of curling up like this is now taking our spine through a trunk flexion perspective. Now again, at this point in time, it's just my cervical or the vertebrae that make up my neck, and the thoracic, which is the bit that makes up where my ribs are. That's the bit that I'm flexing, and I'm not actually flexing too much with my lower back. I can then do a lower back version by doing kind of like a reverse sit-up or something like this, where I'm now contracting my abs and I'm now curling up the lower part of my spine. So again, both of those movements, the normal crunch will work the upper part of my spine in terms of flexion, and a reverse crunch will work the lower part of my spine with flexion. So that's flexion. And as I mentioned before, is that typically we see that people, certainly in the top part of their spine, will be in a flexed position, mostly purely because of bad posture and seated positions. The next one, which is extension, that's the one where we get into a bit of trouble. Now, the thing you want to be really careful about is a lot of people get into some sort of passive position like this, trying to get some sort of trunk extension, and without good core control and well-developed musculature, even this exercise can put a little bit of load on your lower back. So I always get my clients to be very careful when they're doing any sort of exercise, any sort of lowering down like that has to be done quite slowly. Now what I do want them to be able to do though, is I do want them to be able to do some sort of extension type of movement. And what I would call a super is an excellent movement. And you can do this in a number of ways. So, the sort of advanced version is to do an upper and a lower body super. So you will lift up and bring your legs up and bring your arms up at the same time and hold that position for a few seconds and then come them down. You can just do the upper body and hold that position, or you could even just squeeze and bring the legs up and lower down. But in terms of trying to get good extension through the upper part of your spine, then this part of the movement is really key. Now, amazingly, I have a number of clients who The extension part is really limited, and they cannot get their arms off the ground in this position. So when they are down like this, and I ask them to lift up, they can't get high enough to be able to get their arms off the ground. They just can't do it. So they kind of here, and that's it, and they're stuck. So, it's two things. One, there's a little bit of shoulder mobility issue, but it is just their inability. They do not have the strength or the mobility to be able to get themselves up into some sort of extended position. And that really is limiting, because it then puts you in potential risk of danger if you ever get forced into that position for one reason or another, and some load gets placed upon you. Your spine and your supporting musculature is not going to have any idea what to do, and you're potentially at risk. And it limits the movements that your whole body should be able to do. So they're the first two movements which, again, will really ensure that you do develop the appropriate strength for taking that spine through this sort of plane, forwards and backwards. Now, there's a trunk rotation as well, and you can do a trunk rotation in many ways. And I'm just going to show you kind of like just a simple version, which is a combination of extension and rotation, which is really quite a nice exercise. So this is a super that I'm going to do that I'm going to add a rotation to. So I'm just going to do my upper body part. So I'm going to lift up to this position here, and then I'm going to try and rotate at the same time, and then come on down. And then come up, and I'm going to do a super, and then rotate the other way, and then come on down. And any sort of variation on that is an excellent way of starting to really strengthen that whole spine and core to be able to start moving that spine into that plane and that position that we don't do very often. And then the last movement you can do is what's called lateral flexion. And so again, the spine should be capable of being able to bend to one side and the other. And in that article I wrote last week, it was interesting is that I was sort of highlighting, and I showed a couple of pictures where sometimes you'll ask a person to bend to the side, and what will happen is they'll stick their hip out, so they'll stick their hip out this way, and then kind of like just sort of tilt their body from the hip and not actually get too much spinal bend. So what you want to do is you want to make sure you keep your hips stable and you bend from here upwards and try and get as much of a curve in your spine sideways again as you possibly can, both ways. And again, this is another area that as we get older, we just get stiffer and stiffer. The lumbar spine doesn't want to bend, the thoracic spine doesn't want to do anything, and so we end up getting really stuck, and that leads to problems. So again, a simple exercise would be in this position here, just bending, not letting those hips drop out. So just bending to the side, keeping side on, reach down as far as you can, touch the ground if possible, coming up, reach down the other side, touch the ground if possible. And again, that just starts to improve, again, the mobility of the spine in this particular plane. And so in summary, what you really want to look at doing then is you want to do some core flexion, core extension, core lateral flexion, and core rotation. So based on those exercises we just covered, this is the sort of routine that I would suggest that you can do. And I'll put that in the link below so that you then can have access to that information. But otherwise, what I will do is in subsequent weeks, I will show you a bunch of brand new exercises. So over a few weeks, you'll have kind of like a suite of little routines you can do, all aimed at improving your spine mobility, which then will actually help improve posture and just overall daily functional movements. Until then.